Welcome to IJ4EU Confidential. I'm Timothy Large.
And I'm Milica Miletic.
And we're both from the International Press Institute in Vienna, where we run the Investigative Journalism for Europe Fund. And our mission is to take you behind the scenes of groundbreaking cross-border journalism. And as always, we have a live audience, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat. We'll get to them as soon as we can. And of course, you can watch or listen to past episodes of the IJ4EU Confidential podcast on the IJ4EU website, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Last month, we had Sanjana Varghese here talking to us. She's currently with the New York Times, but right before that, she worked on a project together with a group of investigative journalists on Russia's drone warfare in Ukraine.
It was really interesting. We also had a special episode looking at the Gaza Project. Now, for those who don't know, the Gaza Project is an incredible collaboration. I think it's between 50 journalists, 13 organizations. And what's incredible about it is that it completely contradicts the Israeli military's denials about targeting the press since the Gaza war started. So that's not to be missed. But let's get to today's investigation, which is yet another exceptional example of cross-border collaboration. And this one really has a bit of everything. It's a climate story, it's an energy story, it's a story indirectly about Russia's war machine, and it's a story about sanctions. It's called Defusing a Russian Carbon Bomb. It was a joint investigation by a whole bunch of organizations: Paper Trail Media, Der Spiegel, ZDF in Germany, the newspaper Der Standard in Austria, Le Monde in France, and the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, an international network of data journalists.
And we're very delighted to have two journalists today with us, two journalists who worked on this project. Those are Sophia Baumann, she's an investigative journalist at Paper Trail Media, and Louis Goddard, co-founder of the Data Desk. Welcome both. And at the very beginning, before we start talking about the investigation, tell us something about yourself.
Hi, I'm Sophia Baumann. I'm working as investigative reporter for Paper Trail Media. We are a newsroom in Munich, working with the magazine Der Spiegel in Germany and public broadcasting ZDF, as well as the Austrian Standard and the Swiss Media Group.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. I'm Louis Goddard. I'm the co-founder of Data Desk, which is an investigative consultancy that's part of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. And we do a lot of work on what we call supply chain forensics. So getting a detailed view of global supply chains, mostly in fossil fuels, using data and satellite imagery.
Well, Sophia and Louis, thanks so much for joining us today, and congratulations on the project, which may seem a little like a ancient history. It was last year, wasn't it? But I'm so glad we have the chance now to talk a bit about it. I said earlier that this is an investigation with a bit of everything, and I love that about it. It's a complex story, but let me see if I can just summarize it briefly for our audience. And please do tell me if I get something wrong or if you want to add to it. But to set the scene, a little context might be useful. The first thing to know is that Russia depends on revenues from fossil fuel exports for, I think it's around half of its state budget. And that means that anything that increases those fossil fuel revenues could be said to fund, in a very real sense, Russia's war in Ukraine. So that's one reason why this story matters. The second thing you need to know is that Russia has been building an enormous energy project in the far north of Siberia. It's called Arctic LNG 2. I'm sure you're going to tell us all about it. And its purpose is to basically produce and export liquefied natural gas, or LNG. But the third thing you need to know is that this Arctic LNG 2 facility is an environmental monster. Critics say that over its lifetime, it's going to produce a hell of a lot of carbon emissions. It's at a billion or more tons of carbon emissions. And that's why it's called a so-called carbon bomb. This term carbon bomb refers to a whole lot of mega carbon projects around the world that threaten to derail efforts to limit global warming if they all go off. And that's another reason why this story is important. And the fourth thing you need to know is that Russia can't build this mega carbon bomb without hardware and know-how from Western countries, including the EU. So at this point, you might think, okay, mega Russian LNG project sounds like bad news for the environment. If it's built, maybe the money from that's going to help fund Russia's war in Ukraine. So that's not good. However, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and the West imposed sanctions. And you would think, presumably, that those sanctions would prevent Western technology and expertise and so on going to Arctic LNG 2. So end of problem, can't be built. But here's the kicker, and this is what you reveal in your investigation. Despite all those sanctions, you show that European companies continue to provide high-tech equipment and engineering services to Arctic LNG 2. And basically, in doing so, they helped Russia complete the first part of this project right on schedule in the summer of 2023, long after the invasion of Ukraine. Now, is that a fair summary? Sorry for the long-winded one, but I just thought there are so many strands I wanted to bring together. Does that do justice to your project?
I think that's perfect. Yeah, I think that really encapsulates it.
Great. So audience members, please feel free to type in your questions or thoughts and we will get to them. But while you're doing that, let's start to drill down a bit.
Well, thank you, Tim, for this introduction, but let's ask them something that we could not find out on our own. Tell us about the Arctic LNG 2. Paint us a picture. How does it look like, that carbon bomb in the making?
Here's a picture. Here's a couple of pictures just for our audience to look at. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction. I think you already mentioned a lot of really important points of this project. I think there are, like, first of all, two reasons why we were really interested in that project. So first of all, there were several political reasons, right? So Arctic LNG 2 is really a huge gas project. So it was meant to increase the production of or the production capacities of Russian LNG by more than half. So that's a really, really important project for Russia. One can tell that from the fact that it was President Putin himself who was the one who launched the first line of Arctic LNG 2 in July 2023. So to summarize that point, it's really the revenues of LNG are relevant to the Russian economy, and that means also, of course, they are relevant to the war economy. So one can criticize, at least since the Russian invasion in Ukraine in 2022, one can criticize this project for political reasons. So that was one reason why we looked into that huge project. But then, as you mentioned, there are also a lot of environmental problems with that. So the Arctic LNG 2 project is located in the Ob Bay. That's part of the Arctic Ocean. It's in the very north of Russia. And the problem with this Ob Bay is that it is rather shallow. So in order to enable the big Russian or the big LNG ships to go there to access the LNG plants, you will have to have the sea bottom dredged. And that's really quite a big environmental problem, according to several researchers, because it may lead to the extinction of several unique animal species, and also activists from the population there, from indigenous population there, they really fear for consequences from these projects. So there are really specific environmental consequences probably from this project in the region. And in addition to that, there's of course the general problem with LNG. So LNG is far more harmful to the climate than conventional gas is, for example. And maybe I'll explain why. So the idea of LNG is to cool natural gas down in specific plants so that it reaches about minus 162 degrees. And at that temperature, the gas becomes liquid and it significantly decreases its volume also. And that's really important because that means that you can transport it via pipelines, and that they don't have to transport it via pipelines, but you can load it on these special ships for which the sea is stretched. So you can you can load it on these ships, and then you can bring it to the destination you want to have it, and then you will reheat it. And only if it's reheated, you can feed it back into the national gas networks. And the problem is that this cooling, transporting, and reheating process, of course, consumes a lot of additional energy in addition to the gas itself, which means that it is even more harmful than like natural gas, which is transported via the classic pipelines. So we have several problems with this project, and that was the reason why we looked into it, and why we started with this investigation, I would say.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about that extra layer of emissions just from the sheer process involved in taking this and condensing it and then shipping it all around the world. So presumably that billion carbon, the figure of billion tons of carbon emissions, is that the sum total of not only the gas coming out of the ground, but also all of that extra stuff going on?
Yes, that adds up to the general, Correct.
Yeah, I was going to say that the billion is sort of a general figure for carbon bombs in general. The actual figure for Arctic LNG 2 is, I guess, still to be decided, given how much it kind of operates and how much it ends up shipping. But the analysts agree that it falls within that category.
Right.
If I could just add one little thing on the environmental issues, I mean, when you think about where the project is, it's quite interesting. So it's right at the top, in the Russian Arctic. And so one of the key export routes for that project, as planned, is through what's called the Northern Sea Route. So this is from, if you think about sort of the middle of Siberia at the top of Russia, round sort of eastwards to Japan and China and East Asia more generally. That's frozen most of the year. But as climate change advances and as global warming advances, that sea route is opening up and is providing a really, really important sort of lifeline for Russia post-sanctions for exporting its LNG and other sort of fossil fuel products. So it's kind of a weird one. It ties in with the sort of overall warming of our planet. The more it warms, the more LNG can be exported from projects like this without having to go westwards through Europe.
Now tell us a little bit about the Western companies that you found to be acting, shall I say, not in the spirit of the sanctions. I'm talking about the international partners of the private Russian company that leads this project. I believe it's called Novatek. Who are these partners, and what was their role in Arctic LNG 2?
Yeah, sure. I can give a little summary of that. So, I mean, just to start with Novatek itself, it's an interesting company because, I mean, people will know that Russia has many sort of big state-owned enterprises that operate in areas of the fossil fuel industry in that country. So you'll have heard of Gazprom, Rosneft, companies like that. Novatek's a little bit different. So it's a private company, and it's been very successful in the last sort of decade or so in capturing a lot of market share in gas and oil exports. So it's run by a guy called Leonid Mikhelsen, who is, according to some reports, a close associate of Vladimir Putin himself. He was sanctioned by the UK in April 2022 after the invasion. But Novatek itself has been on the sanctions list in the United States for a bit longer. So the context as this project was getting going and investment was coming in was that the main sort of Russian company behind it was already sanctioned by the US post sort of invasion of Crimea. The European companies that are involved, so the key investor from a European side, so the investors in the project were mainly European, Japanese and Chinese due to the US sanctions. So the key investor was Total Energies, formerly known as Total, the big French national oil company, or formerly national oil company. The engineering work and that's the stuff that we mostly looked at was done by a consortium of a French company called Technip Energies, an Italian company called Saipem, which is a very large oil field services conglomerate that's partly owned by the Italian state via Eni, the national oil company there, and then a Russian company called Nipigas. So if you imagine these three companies cooperating in a sort of consortium to do what's called the EPC work, so engineering, procurement, and construction. So Novatech contracts them, and they basically manage the logistics of all of the construction of the projects, which is very complicated because you have bits and pieces being built in Chinese shipyards. You have a main center of operations in Murmansk in northern Russia. You have turbines and things that, like Sophia will go on to talk about, heat exchangers and things like that being manufactured in European factories. And then these three companies together are sort of bringing things together and coordinating all of that. So our partners at Le Mans, who aren't here today, did absolutely fantastic work on Technip in detail, and I think we'll get onto them in a second. And Sophia worked on Linde, a German company that was also involved.
Yeah, maybe
Now,
I can. Sorry.
Please go ahead.
I can add a little bit from Linde's side, because that's something we did a lot of research here in Germany, as it is a former long-standing German company, which is now based in Dublin, however. So maybe also to just give a little bit of overview of how we did that. So we already knew from different public sources like industry magazines or Russian media that Linde has been really active in this project, in this Arctic LNG project, for a long time. And so we knew, for example, that Linde was part of a joint venture until 2021 that did kind of the basic planning for the construction of this LNG plant. Also, as Louis already said, we looked a lot into heat exchangers, and that's because Linde promised to supply these heat exchangers for the project, and heat exchangers are really important components of such plants. So that was really interesting. And in addition, Linde also helped the Russians to manufacture these heat exchangers themselves in St. Petersburg. So they had a joint venture with Russian company, and they decided not to produce them only in Europe, but also in Russia itself. And what was interesting to us is that experts really told us that Russia would not have been able to do such a project without the support of Western companies, not only Linde, but also others. So that was the reason why we wanted to check how these Western companies continued to support the Arctic LNG 2 project also after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Yeah.
Well, that was my next question. How are they able to, shall we say, skirt or evade these sanctions? And to what degree is this a kind of calculated effort to skirt the sanctions, and or is it more nuanced and complicated than that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Tim. So I think basically, if I could just set the scene for, after the invasion happens, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a big scramble to sort of implement sanctions that can have an effect on Russia's fossil fuel industry. So everyone will probably know about the restrictions on Russian oil exports that came in, the price cap on Russian oil exports. So now if you are a trader trying to buy and then sell Russian oil, you can only do so at a certain lower level than the market in order to kind of restrict their revenues. The EU was at the forefront of doing some of these sanctions. It took a little bit longer than some other countries, just due to the sort of standard European kind of discussions and many parties involved. But sanctions did come in, obviously on oil exports, but then on LNG liquefaction equipment being shipped to Russia. So key oil industry equipment started to be sanctioned or restricted in terms of its exports. So that the key EU law came in May 2022, or at least that was the implementation date. That should have meant that companies couldn't export liquefaction equipment to projects in Russia for LNG projects. But I think, reflecting on it now, I think the crisis moment and the rushed drafting of all of these sanctions and things left potential loopholes, or perhaps the legal text didn't necessarily cover every eventuality for what could have been shipped, as we'll see with what the companies did. So in October 2022, so this is looking at Technip, this was really the main company that Le Monde focused on in their story and one of the key coordinators of Arctic LNG 2's construction. So in October 2022, Technip signed an exit agreement from the project and announced that. And then in July 2023, they announced that exit had been completed. Their withdrawal from the project was complete and that they were no longer involved. So Le Monde zeroed in on the period sort of before their exit, essentially, but while there were already big doubts about how is the project going to be able to continue with all these sanctions coming in, its dependence on European companies, all that sort of thing. So in July 2022, a couple of very big modules for the project. So the project is sort of manufactured in these in a modular way where they kind of build as much as they can on site remotely and then ship a huge sort of piece of equipment over to Russia and kind of plug it in, basically. I'm sure it's a bit more complicated than that, but to simplify. So in July 2022, a couple of very large modules were shipped from a Chinese shipyard with the coordination of Technip and the other EPC contractor partners on the project. The company argues now that those weren't covered by the sanctions, is very clear about that. And you know, that's our position too. The Le Monde's piece basically ended up looking at how are these pieces that are so absolutely essential to the functioning of Arctic LNG 2, how are they not covered in a way by the European sanctions? So they're like pieces for the project wouldn't happen without these modules that were shipped, but they may not be directly designated in the list of, let's say, customs codes that are in the legal text and that sort of thing. So I think it raises an interesting question about how do enforcement bodies do this work well in a time of crisis when you're dealing with a very complex industry like liquefied natural gas. Are we equipped to be able to sort of take the actions necessary when something like this happens again, God forbid?
Well, yeah, that's so interesting. And presumably the companies would say that they are acting in a squeaky clean manner. Is that right? I mean, they would totally rebuff any allegations of sanctions evasion or anything like that. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there's, you know, it's important to sort of see things from every perspective with this type of work and see the real pressures that exist on companies that are, you know, they've got billions of pounds at stake or billions of euros at stake in a project where the timelines are so long. And it's, you know, it's a really tricky position to be in when suddenly in 2022 the legal situation shifts. I suppose the broader argument is that the writing was on the wall a bit as early as 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. So a very tricky balance to be struck, I think, there.
Yeah.
How about?
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
What we could see in many cases of these companies is that they really try to kind of dance a quite delicate tightrope around these sanctions. So they try to kind of figure out how they could do it and probably helped in that way to ensure that crucial components still arrived in Russia before they really couldn't provide them anymore.
That's a really important point. I forgot. Yeah, the logistical work to set up, like, what are the little joint venture companies that have been set up, special purpose companies to ship certain things, or what are the jurisdictions that those companies are in? You know, we saw a movement of the sort of companies involved in the project. These are like small special purpose vehicles from European countries to places like the UAE, other countries that aren't implementing the sanctions. So, yeah, you could see a sort of geographical shift in the involvement in the company from Europe to the Middle East.
I mean, I think if I were a Ukrainian, I'd be pretty annoyed at that, to say the least. But yeah, as you say, it's complex. Yeah. Lisa?
It's very interesting. As you said in your introduction, so many layers and so much to learn from this project. But what I'm particularly interested in is if you could take us in the backstage and how you guys worked, how you coordinated this big project, how did you collect data, which methods did you use, how did it all go? Because I know it wasn't easy, but it will be great to learn how you did it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can start with that one and then pass on to Sophia for a bit of, her take from her side. But so my role really was to, we sort of came up with the idea initially, Anti-Corruption Data Collective, and then sort out the best possible data we could to shed light on this. So I've been using Russian customs data already to track exports of oil and gas from Russia. We got this via a coalition called the Business for Ukraine Coalition, which is a group of NGOs working on these type of issues. So we use that data to we basically flipped it on its head. So instead of looking at stuff coming out of Russia, we started to look at things that are going in. And we zeroed in on certain HS codes, as they're called, the like customs codes that are used in international trade for different types of goods. And we looked in detail at specific pieces of machinery that would be of use in LNG projects. And we also obviously filtered it down to companies that we knew to be involved through sort of corporate intelligence research, or, we'd looked into the corporate networks of the contractors on the project. And so we were able to find when they're receiving important pieces of equipment. The way we usually work actually at DataDesk to verify this type of data is using satellite imagery and AIS data, which is ship position data, which is derived from ships' automatic safety signals that they have to broadcast as they move around, or ideally that they do. You can sort between those three data sources, given that oil and gas industry equipment is so large, it's physically very large, so you can generally see it from space. So between those three data sources, we're able to have a really good picture of what's arriving at the construction yard in Murmansk, and what's happening there just by sort of visually observing, looking at where the ships are moving, and then looking at the customs data.
I may explain it a little bit on the example of Linde, maybe what Louis said in theory. So, for example, in these customs data from we had, we looked for what did the raw manufacturer Linde ship to Russia in the relevant time frame, and what was imported to the Arctic LNG 2 project there. And with that, we just were looking through all these large tables, and then we found like 3 interesting shipments carrying together, I think, around 1,500 tons of equipment from the manufacturer Linde, imported as part of the construction of the LNG plant of Arctic LNG 2. And these shipments were registered on June the 1st, so technically 5 days after the sanctions came into place. But according to Linde, of course, we asked them, they left the European ports before the deadline, which seems legit. So to say it clearly, we do not have any evidence that Linde broke sanctions in that case, and Linde also clearly denied it. But apparently they really used a legal transition period until this May 27th, and continued to deliver to Russia until then, even though it was like months after the start of the war in Ukraine. And probably, or might be that in that way, crucial components for Arctic LNG 2 still reached the construction side of that project. Yeah. So it looks like at least a last minute shipment, right, Louis? Sorry.
Yeah. Looks like it, doesn't it? It sounds like it.
Yeah.
We all learned a lot, I was going to say, about shipping and logistics. My dad actually worked in shipping and logistics all his career, and I never really expressed an interest in it. And then suddenly when I'm doing this project, I'm like asking him questions about, well, how does this work? What does this contract mean? So good to bring in the family.
Good expert to have in your living room, yes.
Yeah.
Melissa, I think you also mentioned the word coordination in your question. I'd be curious to know how, with so many different players involved in this investigation, how did you coordinate all of this? How did you keep the thing sort of on track?
Well, I think this will sound quite familiar to a lot of journalists working on this type of stuff, but lots of signal groups. So we use the encrypted messaging app Signal to communicate. I was in a couple, so we usually kind of divided those up into groups based on particular media partners that we were working with. So with Sophia, with our partners at Le Monde, and then we had a bit of, I think we were all in the different ones and kind of shared things back and forth. It was quite a kind of nice and sort of free approach once we'd initially sort of, speaking from the data desk and anti-corruption data collective side, once we'd sort of shared out the relevant bits of data to the different partners, we then were just playing more of a supporting role in helping them to understand it and to sort of, interpret different bits of it, and then maybe filling in with a bit of detailed satellite imagery work or verification of things that they find in the data. I mean, it's all in Russian, obviously, so that the first challenge was to sort of understand what all the columns and rows and things mean. But kind of supporting them on that.
Yeah. It really came totally naturally in that project. So it was clear that we were interested in Linda, and Le Monde, of course, looked into Technip Energies, and then we had Louis and Sam from Data Desk, who were our customs, satellite, and ship data experts. So that was really nice, yeah.
Yeah, so the thing we were saying earlier about how it's sort of, the project mirrors the Arctic LNG 2 project insofar as it's a very European project with companies from many different countries. I think it works out really well to do a cross-border investigation on that type of topic.
It's perfect for that. And what about the impact of the investigation? Has anything happened or changed as a result of this?
Yeah, always a bit difficult to attribute directly, but I'll go through what's happened since the publication. So Le Monde published their piece on October the 19th last year. The next day, Technip's share price fell very sharply. So Technip is one of the key French companies involved. So after the publication, I think their share price fell by about 20% and remained down for a couple of weeks. They've responded to the allegations, and you can find their response on their website. A few weeks later, so the big news was that the US introduced new sanctions on Arctic LNG 2. So it's worth always remembering that the US is a very large LNG exporter itself. So there may be other interests at play here, but they kind of made good on various statements that have been made over the last several months before that and put sanctions directly on the project and some of the key companies that have been mentioned in the reporting. And that had a catastrophic effect on the project's future ability to export to Europe or the US, because any company involved in taking the cargoes now from the project, if it has operations in the US as well, it will be in huge trouble there. So it's really thrown a spanner in the works and meant that the Russian state and also the Novatek and the other partners in the project are having to consider how they're going to export to China and other places, perhaps slightly under the radar, which maybe I'll get into a little bit later on. But after the US sanctions came in, Novatek itself declared force majeure on the project, which is basically when you say the contract is with its people it was going to supply, with the companies it was going to supply, are now invalid because something terrible has happened that means they can no longer make good on what they promised previously. In January 2024, Total did the same thing, declared force majeure on its stake in its supply agreements from Arctic LNG 2 and sort of took the investment in Arctic LNG 2 off its books. And then in April 2024, liquefaction of gas was suspended at the plant because, well, the reporting at the time was that there's a lack of available tankers to pick up. So one thing we haven't touched on is that in order to pick up gas at this project, you have to use a special type of tanker called an ice class tanker. There aren't that many of them in the world, and to build one is a very intensive piece of work. Not many shipyards, offer this thing, and so Russia was actually having problems securing enough of those tankers to pick up cargoes. That seems to have developed a little bit literally in the last week, where a couple of tankers have been spotted picking up from the project. But perhaps, I'll get into that in a sec. I'll hand over to Sophia.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't forget also about the EU sanctions from June 2024, who are certainly not only directly related to our reporting, but I think it's still interesting what happened since we reported on that. So in June, the EU launched a new package of sanctions against Russia, and it included quite a lot of new measures also against Russian LNG. So all future investments and also exports to LNG projects under construction in Russia are prohibited now. And after a transition period, also the use of EU ports for the transshipment of Russian LNG will be prohibited. And of course, this will also have effects on the Arctic LNG 2 project.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive round of sanctions now.
Very, very, very interesting and very scary. When we were announcing this conversation, when we never actually talk about this project, we always say like how to defuse a Russian carbon bomb. But let me ask you: is it too late to defuse this bomb? Is there anything could be done?
I feel like even though the sanctions from the EU and the US may not have a conclusive effect, it's still clear, and we saw that in our research, that they make a lot of problems for Arctic LNG 2. They make them more difficult.
I think we've lost Sophia for a second.
I
could.
Sorry, can you hear me?
So we're having a few audio issues with Sophia's microphone, I think.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I think you're back now.
We can, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, if you can just repeat, sorry, because we lost you at some point.
No worries. So what I wanted to say is that sanctions clearly make Arctic LNG 2 more difficult, even though they may not have a conclusive effect. So I think still sanctions are the best way to defuse this carbon bomb. So we only just have to find a way that they really work how they should. So they should be as targeted as possible. And I think it's quite an important part of it that people like the press or NGOs are watching them and are checking whether they are targeted enough. Yeah, I think that might be a way to still defuse this carbon bomb.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sophia. I think as I was saying earlier, what we really need is I mean, it's maybe a bit of a unreasonable expectation, but we need more expertise or the ability to draw on expertise quickly by sanctions enforcement bodies, industry expertise, journalists and NGO researchers who know a lot about these issues to be able to write very targeted sanctions legislation in these moments in the future. I think what will happen now is that it will just be, we already have seen this happen. So LNG tankers have been coming up to the project that's now in in production, turning off their safety signals. So this is the data that you can use to track where they are, or spoofing it and pretending they're in a different location than they actually are. And then they come and pick up a cargo. So that's happened twice now. NGOs and journalists have reported on this in the last week or so. And at the moment, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game because we're all watching where the tankers that have picked up LNG from this project are going. It will almost certainly be to not to a European country. It'll be to China, maybe India. We'll have to see. So I think that's the next story, next phase. But even so, I think we can count it partially diffused because the amount of production that they're able to do is much lower than was originally planned in the original, when this was sort of proposed back in 2014.
Absolutely. Must feel really good to have this kind of impact from an investigation. It's quite rare to see such a direct correlation between your work and real world events. Do you have any collaborations in the pipeline? Any other plans to work together on the back of the success of this? I mean, you mentioned the next stage following those sort of the cat and mouse game of tankers around the world trying to figure out who they are. But any other inspirations ahead of you?
I think it's always a difficult question for us because it's difficult for us to talk about what we are doing right now. But
of course,
both of our organizations are members of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, and I think we will for sure work together in future soon. So I think that was a really good collaboration, that project, also together with Le Monde, of course. who really did amazing research for this Technip Energy stories. So I think for sure we will work together on new things in future, but I think more
100%.
more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so some of the work that we're doing as Data Desk at the moment that might be relevant is we're doing some work on shipments of high sulfur fuels to African countries. So trying to kind of get a bit beyond just Russia and look at some other sort of global topics. So this is quite an interesting one. It's like the grade of gasoline and diesel that gets sent to West African countries is generally a lot, has higher limits for things like sulfur, benzene, and manganese, chemicals which are dangerous to human health and can damage the engines of cars when they're used. So we're sort of looking in detail at the oil blending in Europe and how recent new laws on exports from key countries like the Netherlands that do a lot of oil blending, whether those have affected what's going to West Africa, and whether new weird and wonderful forms of oil blending are occurring. So oil traders blending up fuels on tankers, or all sorts of other kind of bits and pieces that are going on. So yeah, really just keeping an eye on fossil fuel energy flows and trying to find the sort of problematic bits.
Okay, then, since you'll be working together again,
Hopefully.
let me ask you this: when you look back at the investigation, what was the biggest challenge? What would you have done differently, or what would you do differently next time?
I feel like the biggest challenge for me was that we're really using a lot of different sources for just like one or two incidents. We had only, like, for example, these 3 shipments, and we really used a lot of different methods to verify and to find out more on that. And that's something I didn't do before. Just for one thing, like using satellite images, ship data, customs data, public sources like Russian media or industry magazines, just to clarify one little point. And it was not always easy to put everything together, but I think we did it in the end. So I'm happy with it from my side. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fully agree. It's that thing of like marshalling loads of different sources of information, keeping it all in your head, or at least trying to communicate with other people about it at the same time, which is so difficult. I think added to that is, I don't think either of us speak Russian or have a Russian language background, so we're sort of working in a foreign language. And really, you're working to some extent at the whims of the Russian government as well. So the data we were using as the real key source of the story was Russian customs data. It's sold by third-party data providers, but ultimately they get it from the Russian government. It's all a bit unclear on how it kind of comes to be. It's quite sort of grey market. But what we do know is that as of November, I think, or December last year, it's not available anymore anywhere. So had we wanted to track, recent exports of oil from Russia or stuff going in the coming months, we wouldn't be able to in the same way as we would for this story. So I think it was tricky to kind of get a sense of what that data all meant and then use it as much as we could in the time that we had it and make sure we were sort of focusing clearly on the topic at hand.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia and Louis. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And thank you to our audience for listening as well. The next IJ4EU Confidential is set for September 20th. And we'll be talking about a very different subject. We'll be talking about bears. Did you know that Southern Europe has a bear crisis? Well, indeed it does. So join us for that episode to find out more.
And also join us next month in Athens in late September at IJ4EU annual conference called Uncovered. Check out our website, ij4eu.net. We just published agenda. You will see a lot of interesting and exciting sessions and topics to be covered in Athens in September.
And while we're doing public announcements, let me tell you that on September the 2nd, we'll open the next call for applications to the IJ4EU fund. So if you have an idea for a cross-border investigation, this is your chance to get up to 50,000 euros in grant funding to make it happen. And we also have other forms of support on offer: legal assistance, practical help, so on, networking opportunities, conferences, and plenty. So we hope you'll consider applying. As always, keep an eye on the IJ4EU website. That's IJ4EU.net. We hope to see your application. So thanks again, Sophia. Thanks, Louis. Good luck with all your work, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summer. And see you next time, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
All the best.